Hey folks, my name is Sam Chelberg. I'm from SK Coffee here in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Twin Cities area. I'm also here partnering with Matinee Coffee, a new University of Minnesota student startup. They are a coffee company that is trying to explore and educate coffee drinkers about coffee. And they're doing this through these fun kind of mystery blind coffee tasting events. My company, SK Coffee, my initials, it's not because I'm vain, I promise, but it's more of a stamp of approval, right? So SK Coffee, we are here exploring single origin coffee especially. Later on in this video, we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but we're essentially trying to focus on premium, high quality coffee, bringing into the Twin Cities really fascinating and exciting and unique special coffee that you may not find anywhere else. All right, so what exactly are we doing here? We're sitting here at a table, well, standing, with some ceramic cups in front of us. We're doing what's called a cupping. This is the industry standard way of tasting coffees side by side. It's great for a number of reasons. Like I said, side by side, quite literally you could taste dozens to hundreds of samples all at once because you're not waiting for things to brew and pour through a filter. It's just brewing all at the same time, and there's a whole process. We'll go through that. Also, it's fairly sanitary. You'll have multiple people tasting out of each cup, and how you wash is you just use the little spoon and you're slurping coffee out of it. But basically, it's just a fantastic way to taste coffees side by side, anywhere really. You're taking out all the brewing factors like your your ratio, because it's pretty easy to keep a ratio good. You're also taking away the paper filter factor. That should be an acronym too. But the paper filter, they're all different, and whether they're craft or they're bleached or they're oxidized, they impart a flavor into the coffee. So this is just a great way to taste multiple coffees in a sanitary way, so multiple people tasting the same coffee, and removing all of the external factors in the brewing process, so you're just tasting pure coffee. All right, so what is the equipment we need for a cupping? Well, you need a cup. Specialty coffee companies, there's a bunch of them that have specific sized cups, but basically an 8-ounce ramekin or some kind of like tumbler will work just fine. Really, you can do it in any cup. It's just about making sure that that ratio is consistent, beans to water ratio, okay? So you need two kind of circular, almost like soup spoons. You can see these are kind of special spoons. They're very deep. They're made specifically for cupping, but really any spoon will work. Circular aspect of it is more helpful for the cleaning process, but we'll talk about that later. So you need your spoons. Cups, spoons, you need a grinder. Okay, we've got two different grinders right behind me. We've got this fancy, this is a Matinee EK43S. Don't recommend buying this for your house, very expensive. It's expensive for most coffee shops, but it's a very nice grinder, super consistent. The other one we've got over here is a Baratza Vario. This is a fantastic home burr grinder. Both of these are burr grinders, okay? That's where there are two circular blades going like this against each other. Reason it's so consistent is because when those blades are set in place, they don't move. Okay? So you're gonna get super consistent grinds. The reason this one is gonna be more consistent than that one is simply motor power, okay? This is gonna have a much faster motor, so nothing gets caught in between those and it's just going right through. But this will do just fine. Of course, you got other grinders that are also burr. You can get a hand burr grinder that just takes a little bit more time. It's very satisfying. You can also get a blade grinder, that'll work just fine. We've all seen those. You'll grind, you buy them at Williams-Sonoma or a Target or something to grind nuts or spices or something, but you can buy a $20 Krups blade grinder off Amazon and it is perfectly sufficient, no problem at all. Otherwise, you could buy your coffee ground or grind it at the actual grocery store yourself if you want to do a cupping from grocery store coffee. And I would just set those mills, or what they're called at a grocery store, just set it to kind of a medium grind. That's basically what we're going for here. Last thing you need is hot water, of course. So you can either buy a fancy kettle like this. This is a gooseneck kettle, just a great pour rate, okay? But you can use whatever kettle you want. In fact, you don't need to have an electric precision Fahrenheit degree holding mechanism, okay? You can boil it on the stove, let it sit for a little while. You don't want it to be right off boil. Just let it sit. I like to aim for between 203 degrees to 208 degrees, okay? So if you let that boil, you let it sit for 5 minutes, you've got great water, okay? Last thing, I suppose, in addition to the water, is something you can or don't need to have, but a scale, okay? We've got a scale right here. The best way to measure out coffee ratios is by weight. It's sort of like baking. There's a whole lot of theory behind this, but you can get away with doing this volumetrically. There are resources to figure out how much a teaspoon is generally in grams, but I highly recommend buying a scale and having it set in grams. These aren't too expensive. You can spend $200 or you can spend $30. So we're not talking about a huge investment, and it will increase your coffee experience. Two best things to increase your coffee experience: buy a scale and buy a grinder. Doesn't matter what one. If you buy fresh whole bean coffee, you are going to increase your experience tenfold, I promise you. All right, so we're gonna start our cupping. First thing to do is weigh out our coffee. So we grab our scale, okay? Put that cup on there and we tare it. We're doing everything in grams here, okay? So we're gonna take our bag of coffee and we're gonna weigh out about 12 and a half grams, 12 and a half to 13. Doesn't have to be exact. All right, there we're at 13. So that's sample D. Remember, this is a blind tasting. Now, as you're doing this, I would say examine the whole beans, because that's the very first aspect of any cupping, is taking a look at those beans, just seeing if you notice anything. What's the consistency like? Is there any inconsistencies? Why might that be? Seeing pretty good stuff here. Also, size of beans, that sometimes matters. Color matters too, but that's really more of a roasting situation. That's not really the coffee itself. For a green buyer like me, as a roaster and green buyer for a roasting company, I am not so much thinking about the roasting levels, but you as home consumers may want to consider that. Maybe you find that there are several coffee companies that are sourcing and roasting the same exact coffee, but they're roasting it way differently. That's kind of fun to do. So in that case, I would look for roast level and just notice it. Note all of these things. Don't ever take one thing and say, that's this. That coffee is this because of this one thing. Oh, there's an oily bean in there. It's a dark roast. Well, maybe, maybe not. Have you even tasted it yet? If you haven't, just wait. The tasting, the experience is the aggregate of everything. That's when you can start making decisions about a coffee. All right, now that they're weighed out, we actually don't need the scale anymore, because then we basically just fill up. We know, because of this, we know exactly how much water to put in. We just put it right up to the lip of it. But this next part, we're still going to examine those whole beans, okay? Sometimes you'll have trays sitting in front, because oftentimes when you show up for a cupping, the coffee will be ground depends on, who's hosting it. If it's a wholesaler like an importer or a roaster or something, they may already have the coffees ground, because if there's 100 samples, well, you better get going on the grinding, right? But for our sake, you can examine these whole beans in the cup itself. Again, just kind of look. You can smell. When it's in the open like this and it's whole bean, it's not quite as aromatic. That's the second stage, which is examining the dry aroma, but we'll get there in a second. Just taking a look. Cool. Now, some of these beans, the reason you want to think about how they look and appear, both color, appearance in terms of texture and stuff. If you're trying to do a blind tasting and you're trying to maybe compete with yourself or other people to figure out where these things are from, everything is important. Some coffees have a little bit, there's like little ribs in the coffee. I'm not going to tell you which origins, but some of them are. Some origins just generally have smaller beans that tend to grow in those places. Different varieties are different shapes. Different processes present themselves differently, i.e. washed, natural, honey, extended fermentation, different experimental fermentations like yeast inoculation, spiced processes. These all present themselves at every stage of the tasting, so make note. I am seeing a difference in all of these, so you should too. All right, now that we've examined the whole beans, we're gonna grind these, okay? Like I said, it's about a medium grind. Some people will say between table salt and coarse sea salt, okay? You could get really fancy and do like a screen size and stuff, but it's not necessary to do that, okay? You just gotta grind it, all right? So what we typically like to do if you want to be super fancy is usually purge the grinder, okay? So that means just taking a little bit of the sample that you took from and grinding just a tad of it before you grind your thing, okay? Just to kind of make sure that whatever coffee was in there before isn't gonna come in there. Again, if you don't want to take yourself too seriously, you're probably not gonna notice. But if you wanna go that extra mile, why not, okay? So you just dip it, and hopefully I can make it in time. This is a super fast machine, but there you go. Okay. Why not smell it right away? You should, it's fantastic. Purge a little bit here. All right, so our coffee is ground and we're ready to do the dry aroma smell. Some say you shouldn't wait more than 30 minutes after grinding them, and that's fine. I only mention that only because you have time before needing to put water on there to make sure you really fully examine the dry aroma. This is one of the most fun parts, frankly. So we call it dry aroma because there's a wet aroma that's the next phase, because there's no water on it, obviously. All right, so now you're just noticing anything, just anything that reminds you of anything, any observation. There's no right or wrong answer. Here I'm smelling, I don't know, a little tea-like, okay? What kind of tea? I don't know yet. But tea usually is floral. I'd say it's a floral tea. It's not a black tea. I've tasted coffees that are black tea. This is more floral, jasmine, something like that. This one's very sweet. This one's got a really nice body to it. nutty, creamy. See what I mean though? Those were 4 very different ways to describe. Some were even more specific. Like I could even say this might have some fudge notes to it, okay? That's very specific, but it can also be as broad as it's sweet. Great. You build off of those observations, right? Tea, very specific. All right, now we got to prep with water. We need to move these. I had them off to the side, but we want to have them pretty close here because they need to be, these are our spoon washing, our sort of washing cups, okay? So these are where we're going to prep and sanitize the spoons and wash the spoons from each sample to each sample. And then your other cup will be where you clean it off, and we'll show you. So we have our water ready, and we get going. Brew time for this is about between 4 to 5 minutes. I didn't mention this in the equipment thing, but a timer could be nice, but really just look at a clock, do 4 minutes from then, doesn't have to be exact, and just go. If you have the right size cup, you just go right up to the rim. Easy peasy. All right, now you don't want to disturb these too much, and you can try smelling, but what you'll notice is you won't smell actually too much because all the aromatics that are really happening are just kind of like locked in. What you can see as you do this is this almost like cake on the top or crust. In fact, the next phase is breaking the crust, okay? But let's just for the sake, turn my hat backwards for this. Let's just smell. They'll all generally smell very similar, okay? But the reason you don't want to agitate them too much is because they're steeping right now, all right? So we're just waiting 4 minutes for the steeping. All right, so now the coffee has steeped for about 4 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes, and we're ready to break the crust. This is what's called the wet aroma, all right? So technique here is you just want to swirl it lightly about 3 times. That's the SCA Specialty Coffee Standard. If you want to swirl more, nobody's going to arrest you for doing that. It's fine, but that's generally just all you need to do, okay? 3 swirls, just let the grounds fall to the bottom. But you want to get your nose right up as close as you possibly can, okay? Still have my hat on backwards because you got to get really close to this. This is where you're getting all of that aroma, okay? So notice everything, observe everything. Now, probably asking yourself, well, this one that tasted like tea doesn't taste like or smell like tea anymore. Well, it doesn't need to smell exactly the same, dry and wet, or even taste the same. Now, if that's what you're looking for, you might find some coffees that have chocolate notes in dry, chocolate notes in wet aroma, and chocolate notes in the tasting of the coffee. And that's fine. Personally, for me and what we do at SK Coffee, I like a 3-dimensional experience. I like something different each phase of the tasting experience, including the aroma, right? So the smell is a little different than the initial taste, and then that lasting effect after you sip and let it sit on your palate. I like to have that offer some kind of interest as well, okay? So we're just looking for intrigue, interest, and deliciousness, frankly, beauty in the cup. Now we gotta clean these, okay? And this is where the two circular spoons come in handy. So you do this handy little, I wanna call it a scrum, but I think that's what you do in rugby. So I don't think it's that. Basically, you're just kind of scraping the top. There's kind of this like bubbly, foamy stuff. You don't really wanna sip it. It's not bad for you, but it's not the true essence of the coffee. So we wanna get rid of it. Doesn't have to be perfect, just get as much as you can off. The bubbles tend to eventually kind of gravitate toward the edge anyways. But if some pesky bubbles are not moving, grab them with your spoon. Don't be alarmed if some don't have as much foam as others. That's fine too. All right, now that cup is royally bubbly and foamy, you just can move that off to the side, and then you've got your other clean cup to wash these out. You also don't need that second one, so if it's getting in your way or whatever, you can set that one aside too. You just need one to taste. Now, kind of want to let this cool. Coffee is best tasted closer to your body temperature. Now, I'm not talking 100 degrees, but I'm talking more like, 130 rather than 195, okay? So you just want to kind of let it sit. I personally like to taste it from as hot as I can handle down through all the way to room temperature, mostly because my customers, or the community members who are tasting SK Coffee, they might like it like the good Midwesterners love that boiling, piping hot coffee. Well, I want to make sure that what we're sourcing and roasting is going to taste good from hot to room temperature. The room temperature is a difficult one to achieve because usually coffee, after it cools that much, is going to be super bitter and just pungent, not something that's super enjoyable. But if you can find one that still maintains some sweetness and acidity, some chocolatiness, that's a great coffee. So while we're waiting, what are we talking about here when we talk about single origin coffee, variety process? I've said a few of these words earlier. What do these mean? So single origin quite literally means coming from a single place. Now, if you go to Starbucks, you'll get their reserve, right, or whatever's on drip. Mostly they do blends in their traditional drip, but they have those Clover fancy machines for their reserves. They're gonna have things like Kenyan or Costa Rican or Ethiopian, right? Now, all that really means, and I can promise you, but don't quote me necessarily, but I would bet a lot of money that that's just generally coming from the entire country, okay? So it could be coffee from Eastern and Western, Central, Northern, Southern Guatemala, right? And they just say Guatemalan, okay? But what we're trying to do in the specialty coffee is be a little bit more specific than that, because let's say a country like Peru, which is a huge country, okay? We know even within one state that the weather in northern Minnesota is way different than southern Minnesota, okay? During polar vortex, you get -50 in upstate Minnesota, and in the southern, you may dip below 0, okay? That's a 50-degree difference just in one state. So obviously the growing conditions are gonna be very different, the microclimates are very different, and so within a country of origin, expand that statewide to countrywide, okay? So that is vastly different from Eastern to Western Guatemala. So not only are we trying as an industry to be more specific in terms of region, we're even being more specific to specific like microregions, I guess, or like neighborhoods, you could say, or like valleys, okay? In Burundi, for example, and in Rwanda, they're all based on hills. It's really cool. The landscape are just these kind of hills. And each hill around coffee growing nations generally has its own washing station. And so all the farmers around that hill, or mountain, whatever you want to call it, they all will bring their coffee to that same washing station. And so you can get a kind of generalized flavor profile of that specific hill, okay? We're also getting so down into it where we're doing even lots. So there's a farmer we work with, a farm down in Ethiopia that we work with that actually has specific subplots on their land that are maybe half to a hectare big. This is a small amount of land. And so we're getting really specific here, okay? So that's kind of what we're talking about with single origin. It's just coming from a single place. Blends are not single origins. However, I suppose you could do a blend from one area. That seems like an interesting concept. Maybe for another video we can talk about that, okay? Process, okay? So all coffee comes in a cherry, all right? If you didn't know that, now you do. It's pretty fascinating. It's really the pit, a dense pit of a tropical cherry grown between the Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer, okay? Generally. Now, you have to remove that pit from the cherry, okay? So how you do that varies, but essentially the kind of basic and main method that's used in coffee right now, for lack of a better term, is called the washed process. So basically you put it through these big squishers, essentially, and it squishes the coffee cherry, and the rind goes out this side, and the seed goes out this side, right? Then it goes in these water troughs, and it's washing the mucilage off. Then it sits in these vats, because if you know like a peach pit, you might be able to peel the peach rind and the flesh of the peach off, but that pit still holds on to some of that flesh, right? Well, it's hard to get off. And with coffee, you're dealing with millions of seeds, right? So you're not going to individually scrape. That's ridiculous. So the quickest method is fermenting it. Basically, you let it sit in these vats for between 12 to 90, 100, 900 hours. The latter is more experimental, and that's happening more and more, but that's a digression. So you let it sit in that vat for, let's call it 24 hours. The next day, you release it from that vat, and you have it with these little rakes down this water trough, and it gets rid of all that mucilage and kind of yucky water, whatever. Then it's dried under the sun, and there you go. There's then a process, you have to remove the parchment, but that's slightly more complicated. So let's just talk about how it gets out of the cherry and is dried, okay? The opposite end is called the natural process. Now this is literally where you just essentially let the seeds dry inside the cherry. You just pick them and you let them dry either on patios, just these big giant patios, and they're just laid out, or on raised beds. Two very different methods, two very different flavor profiles that are imparted. Now, the last thing I just want to talk a little bit about is the idea of variety, okay? So generally in the, well, almost exclusively, I'd say. I say almost because I guess I don't know if all specialty coffee is Arabica. But generally, that's kind of the rule of thumb. We're dealing with Café Arabica, C-O-F-F-E-A Arabica, okay? Then there's Coffee Robusta or Coffee Carnifera. Okay, Robusta is used largely in instant coffee, which is the most consumed coffee actually globally. Oddly enough, you probably didn't know this because you're a specialty coffee snob. But within the Coffee Arabica family, or the species really are subspecies, okay, varietals. And inside there, we used to think, well, Arabica is Arabica is Arabica. It is not true at all. An apple is different than a pear, right? So that's, this might be a slight misalignment in terms of an analogy, but Robusta and Arabica, I think taste that different between a pear and an apple. Now, in an apple, you would never say that a Honeycrisp tastes the same as a Fuji as it tastes the same as a Macintosh. Here in Minnesota, we would never say that, right? We know that a Honeycrisp is much more crispy and sweet and lovely compared to something you might bake, like a crab apple, okay, with. That's what we're dealing with now. That's where the world of specialty coffee is going, is we're singling out varieties. The most famous and probably the most revolutionary that pushed everything was the geisha, okay? Often mispronounced geisha, and it is not a comparison to the Japanese term. It is actually named after the mountain in Ethiopia from which this variety was supposedly originated, okay? But it was made famous in Panama, okay? The geisha variety is this beautiful floral coffee, and grown anywhere, it really has a lot of the same characteristics, obviously different based on terroir, microclimates, etc., soil, blah, 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 okay? But that variety pushed the bounds, and now we're experimenting and trying to pull out. Pacamara is a really beautiful variety. Pink Bourbon, which is a strain of the Bourbon family, which also has yellow and red Bourbon. It's amazing. There's so many different varieties, and they all have their different perspectives. All right, let's get tasting. Now, this is the fun part, okay? If you were tasting with a bunch of people, you could have a competition on whose slurp is the loudest or the most unique. But all we're going to do is we're going to take this spoon, and we're going to take a little bit of coffee, and we're going to slurp. Some very basic sanitary considerations. Do not, if you have still more coffee left in the thing and you've already slurped, do not pour that coffee back into that. Nobody wants that. Just put it into the cup, the sanitation cup, clean it off, and move on to the next sample. Generally, you also want to wash this off in order to not contaminate this between samples. If you forget to do it, it's not the end of the world. You don't have to scrap it. It's just we want to try to not get coffee D into coffee C, coffee A into coffee C, etc. But let's just go for this. Let's start at A. All right, well, A, I'm noticing a lot of chocolatey notes. Might say praline. Now the reason you're slurping is because you want to aerate that coffee. You want to get that coffee on every part of your palate. It's very similar to wine, beer. I don't know about spirit tastings, but I believe you don't want to aerate it, but that's for other reasons. But with wine, it's a very good comparison. You're just trying to aerate it and get it all over all parts of your palate to really hone the individual characteristics. Beautiful chocolatey, creamy coffee. That kind of creaminess has maintained throughout those experiences. For me, it doesn't mean it's bad. Doesn't mean it's bad. I know I said I like different things, but it's a good coffee. I also sourced it and roasted, so. Nice body. A little citrusy too, okay? So it's bold, it's got a nice robustness to it, but it's got a little bit of citrusy note to it. I like that. That is maintained sweetness through the whole thing. Almost fruity-like. Now I say that with some hesitancy. Mostly because you could say that it gives something away, but we'll talk about that when we do the reveal and why I'm being hesitant about that. Oh, that tea-like is just lovely. It's also got almost like a piney coolness to it. You know when you have something that's kind of pine or minty, and you breathe in and it just feels cool all over your mouth. I think it's called astringent, which is usually used as a kind of negative attribute, but that kind of drying effect, something that you might get with like a nice dry Chardonnay, you kind of get that with this, but it's lovely. It's just beautiful cooling effect, despite being a hot beverage. Do a couple passes through. You can also have some bubbly water if you want to cleanse your palate. So one thing I wasn't doing during this process that you may want to do is have a little handy notebook. Kind of write down stuff you're thinking about, okay? Because then we can go back to that at this point and start ticking off things. So, you know, I said tea-like. It was very fluid. It was kind of had these arabesques. It was really smooth and silky. Then it had some piney coolness. These are all major things, if you know what you're tasting for too, that would indicate where this is from. Fruity, sweet. You could probably guess if you knew which four you're working from, which one this is. A little boldness, a lot of body, some citrus notes. Those are good indicators for this coffee as well. Creamy, nutty, chocolatey, smooth. Those are also great indicators for this coffee too. So at this point you can kind of assess and make a good educated guess. If you're not trying to do blind tasting and you end up taking this method to other types of tastings, you can also, you know, if you're just trying to say which coffee you like, if you're a green buyer, for example, I would just say do whatever assessment that makes sense to you. Have this be the moment where you're kind of thinking about those things. All right, so here's the big reveal. I'm just gonna do one last tasting for each of these as we reveal it, okay? Just to kind of walk you through maybe your own tasting notes and observations. So again, A, I think is super creamy, smooth. Might even be specifically some praline, that kind of nutty, kind of fudgy note, right? So what might it be? All right, it is a coffee from Huehuetenango that is in the western region of Guatemala. This is a washed process. This is a fantastic growing region. I say praline, that was a little bit of a placebo effect perhaps, because a lot of coffee from Huehuetenango has that kind of praline, nutty fudge kind of flavor profile. So if you guess Guatemala, the Huehuetenango washed, well done. Next coffee. Good body. Again, citrus. This is a very key thing. So it has this cool like boldness, but also a little bite with that citrus acidity. Okay. And it is Peruvian from Chanchamayo. Fantastic. This is from a great importer and actually farmers that we work with. They're a completely vertically integrated company called Village Coffee Imports and Shared X Farmer Project down in Peru. That's a good coffee. It's good coffee. A lot of coffee, especially in the northern region, is going to have that kind of lemon lime citrus note. I tasted this is a side note, but I got to taste and actually meet the farmer who won the Cup of Excellence back in 2018. If you don't know the Cup of Excellence, check it out. It's amazing. It's a competition for farmers in different origins. But I got to meet Dwight, who was the farmer who won, and his coffee, I swear, tasted like Mountain Dew, like just straight lemon lime sweet. Oh my gosh, it was unbelievable. This has some of that, but this coffee didn't win Cup of Excellence. It also didn't cost $50 a pound green. So, but it's a good coffee, very good coffee. Next coffee. Okay, When I said I was kind of reluctant to say that it was fruity, it's because natural processed coffee, which is indeed what this one was, the Guatemalan, Lake Atitlan is a specific area of western Guatemala. It's very close to Huehuetenango, generally the kind of same western highlands of Guatemala. Natural processed coffees will almost without failure impart some kind of fruity note to it. Specifically, I find that this coffee in particular has almost like a raspberry sweetness to it, but still has some of those chocolatey, robust notes below it, okay? Really fun coffee. This is our third season actually buying and roasting this coffee. We just love it. Last coffee. Now, as it's cooling, wow, that piney tea-like stuff. This should be very obvious, but I'm gonna reveal it so I can start talking about it. Boom, Limu, or the Kaffa region of Ethiopia. This is from a farmer, Tegantula Specialty Coffee Farm. We've been buying from them for about 3 years now too. Now, washed coffee from Ethiopia, this specific region, is going to have that kind of piney, cool, tea-like sweetness to it. It's unbelievable, silky smooth, delicious. And if you're able to find one that projects that kind of piney coolness, buy it and enjoy it as much as you can. It's fantastic, fantastic coffee. All right, so those are our 4 coffees, 4 different flavor categories, which is how we source our single origins. 3 different regions, 2 in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, and the Eastern Hemisphere, a nice African coffee. All right, folks, well, there we go. We did our little blind tasting. We did a cupping. If it was your first time, congrats. Now you've officially gone down the rabbit hole of specialty coffee. I just want to thank you for joining us. At this point, you guys can order this experience through Matinee. Just a reminder, this is a partnership, and Matinee Coffee is organizing and doing this whole thing, all right? So their whole pitch, again, is to educate and explore coffee with their customers and community. And they're doing this through these blind tasting experiences. Really fun stuff. Works very well for us, and happy to have partnered with them, SK Coffee. Again, I'm Sam, founder and head roaster of SK Coffee, also the green buyer, I suppose. But we love these kinds of things. So it's a really beautiful symbiotic relationship. So we're happy to have been a part. So please join. And if you are already, thank you for joining, and we'll catch you around town. Thanks. Hey folks, my name is Sam Chelberg. I'm from SK Coffee here in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Twin Cities area. I'm also here partnering with Matinee Coffee, a new University of Minnesota student startup. They are a